Alright, well, this is our next video, and today we're going to look at the PowerPoint or the presentation. It might not be a PowerPoint for you, but this is going to be a little bit about the cycles that we were talking about in class that I introduced to you. There are three main cycles that happen in ecology, in the environment, that influence organisms and humans, and these are the learning objectives here. I picked these right off of our learning objectives page. So check through those. We're going to learn about the carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen cycle and the water cycle, and then we're going to explain how that impacts the environment and populations. Okay, so I'm going to put this on slideshow form for you, and I'll click through it for you. So all matter is cycles. Nothing can be created or destroyed. So when you look at the Earth, it's still the Earth. It doesn't disappear. And when we talk about the cycles, we're talking about the movement of certain chemicals through an ecosystem or through the Earth. And when we're talking about that, we're referring to carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen, or molecules of water. And so I'll go into each one of those separately. You know that hopefully that producers make their own food from the sun, and then consumers feed on those producers and use that for energy, and then get rid of waste too. And eventually, obviously, those die, and decomposers can break them down back into the soil again. The first cycle is the water cycle. That's a pretty easy one to explain, and you can go on to Moodle or to any website and look this up too to see some diagrams. But the one I've shown you here, we're going to kind of start with, let's say, we can start up here with the clouds. When water vapor evaporates off of a surface or body of water, it condenses, cools down into a cloud, and that's called condensation. And then when that falls down as rain or snow, that's called precipitation. Trees actually lose water sometimes too. Even though we want to water them, they actually can lose water through their leaves, and that's called transpiration. There are little holes in the leaves that let out the water. And then there's also human impact here, where you can see some farms and some industry where they release things into the water supply, and that gets put into like rivers and lakes and streams, and that can also be have something to do with the evaporation and where the water comes from as well. So I've mentioned all of these terms, but again, we call water that enters the ocean, we call that runoff. Water that kind of seeks through, like down this mountain here, and kind of goes into the water supply is called runoff. And as I said, we have evaporation that forms clouds. The other cycle, the second cycle, is called the carbon-oxygen cycle, and it really has to do with two processes. One is photosynthesis, where plants or other organisms are making their own food, carbohydrates, and then animals eat those, and animals take in oxygen, and they take in the food, and they release carbon dioxide, and that's called respiration. And then we've got something like cars that release carbon into the atmosphere too, when you burn oil or gas or coal, that kind of stuff. And so when those things die, then they get broken down underneath the ground by what we call decomposers that decay them, and that can also add carbon into the environment. The plants take in carbon dioxide, and they release oxygen and sugar. So it's kind of a nice little arrangement we have with the plants, where you can see this kind of circle thing happening, where plants take in the carbon dioxide and they release oxygen, and the organisms take in that oxygen. And I'm going to give you a second. You can always pause the video at any time so that you can have the bubbles, but I'll leave them up for just a second. So that's the carbon-oxygen cycle. The hardest cycle to understand is probably the nitrogen cycle, and that relies on you understanding that plants need nitrogen to grow. And we actually get nitrogen from the atmosphere, and there are bacteria in the soil that are called nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and they are involved with taking that nitrogen and converting it into what we call ammonia, NH4. And then there are other bacteria that do what we call nitrification, and they are going to take that NH4 and they're going to convert it to something called nitrates, which are actually very good for the soil and help the soil grow, and that's called NO3. So nitrates are very important, and so there's a separate set of bacteria that do that. They're called nitrifying bacteria. And then there are bacteria called denitrifying that take that NO3 and turn it right back into the nitrogen in the atmosphere, free nitrogen gas. And again, consumers like rabbits will eat the plants, and again, when the plants decompose, some of that nitrogen gets returned back into the soil. So nitrogen fixation is N2 to NH3. Nitrifying is converting the ammonia to nitrates, and converting the nitrates back to free nitrogen is called denitrification. Nitrogen is really important for amino acids and making proteins in your body. And again, when things die, then bacteria can break them down and return some nitrogen into the atmosphere and into the soil. And as I've mentioned, when you're talking about things like cutting down trees, that's going to affect how much oxygen is made and how much carbon dioxide will build up, on a certain area. And you could see that for the last, although this is a graph, but the trend has just kept going up. But you could see how much, since we've gotten more cars that have been using gasoline, you could see the amount of carbon dioxide that's been released by the burning of that. Nitrogen cycle, we have fertilizers like nitrates that go into the soil from the nitrogen cycle that help plants grow. But then if there's too much growth, it's called eutrophication, and that is a rapid overgrowth of plants, and especially in the water, it makes it so that fish can't live in the water anymore, and so that is something that we don't want: eutrophication, an overgrowth, too many of these fertilizers. That's why we need the bacteria in there to take some of those nitrates and convert them to other things, so that we don't have too much nitrates helping to fertilize the plants too much. We don't want too many plants. So you can see here, if this is a water supply and there's tons of plants in there, no fish will be able to live in there because they won't be able to see, or they'll get caught in all the plants. So even though we want nitrates in our soil through the nitrogen cycle, we don't want too many. And of course, I think you know about this, but the water cycle is extremely important for plants. We got to always kind of keep the water recycled. We are influenced by that in terms of things that get into the water and things get into our water supply. And so, you cut down trees, for example, and there's less transpiration and less water vapor added. So that's important too, to our climate and our weather. And that's the end of the slideshow. I'm not positive this worked, but we're going to try it. And I hope you can. Whoops, I don't know what that is, but we're going to say yes.